All right, key concept 8.3. We're almost through the AP US curriculum here. This is our second to last guided lecture, I know. Very sad. We're going all the way back to the 1950s again, one more time. And we're going to go up through the 1970s as we talk about post-war economic and demographic changes, which had far-reaching consequences for American society, politics, and culture. A lot of this unit is housed in the 1950s and 1960s, although we'll definitely touch on the 1970s as well. It's a pretty short unit. I think it might be our shortest unit in terms of days spent in class and in terms of probably this guided lecture. Well, we'll find out. So our big idea questions here. First, how did economic growth impact American society and American values? We're talking mostly post-World War II here. Late 1940s all the way through the 1950s and early 1960s, America is doing incredibly well economically. What effects did this have on American society and American values is very much a question that is of interest to historians and will be of interest to us. Second, how did new immigration laws in 1965 impact immigrants? Your textbook only touches on this. It just kind of mentions it in I think, one paragraph. But this is an important one for us. Immigration is something that our country is still very much talking about today. And there's some pretty major changes that are made in 1965, which change that quota system that we studied back in the 1920s. So we'll take a look at that in class. Third, how did counterculture impact American society? It's actually a pretty small movement, but it has a big impact on American society. And four, what factors led to the resurgence of conservatism during the 70s and 80s? We started talking about this in our last unit, in Key Concept 8.2. We'll continue that discussion as we look ahead to the 1980s, and we'll talk about the rise of conservatism as well as evangelical Christianity, which are closely related. So key concept 8.3, Roman numeral 1, rapid economic and social changes in American society fostered a sense of optimism in the post-war years. If the late 1940s through the early 1960s are remembered for anything in mainstream American culture, they're probably remembered for optimism and economic growth. We've already taken a look at the reform movements that are happening, the civil rights movement, women's rights movements, when we're talking 1950s and early 1960s. There's a lot of optimism inherent in those movements too. And so when we're looking at mainstream American society and culture, tons of optimism. So why? Increasing private sector due to a litany of factors, increase in federal spending. This is driven, I should go back for a second, this is driven by the Cold War, a lot of this, the increase in federal spending, right? Because we have to make sure the Soviet menace doesn't spread, things like, think about like the Marshall Plan, for example, federal spending, but also, the increased size of the military, which Dwight Eisenhower warns us about in his farewell address, increased federal spending. That's driving growth, that's increasing jobs. We need people to make all of the military equipment. And so, you see increasing federal spending, which is helping with the American economy. The baby boom generation, this is the largest generation that America has ever seen. So we have more people in the country and more kids in the 1950s and 60s. That's driving growth. You have more kids, you need to buy more stuff for them. And so we see growth due to that. Technological developments, again, Cold War has a strong role to play in this. The space race in the 1960s also has a strong role to play in this. Less so in the 1970s. We see some stagnation there. And then in the 80s, it's really going to take off again when we get the tech boom leading into the 1990s. And so all these factors contribute to economic growth. B talks about the impact of higher education opportunities and new technologies. And we definitely see this throughout the time period. The middle class is continuing to migrate to the suburbs, and this is the largest mass migration time period that we'll see in terms of white flight. As middle-class white Americans are leaving the cities and heading to the suburbs. Why are they going to the suburbs? Well, they're going to the suburbs for a number of reasons, but a couple of these reasons are education opportunities and new technologies. New technologies allow for people to leave the cities. Highways are an example of this. Increased effectiveness, efficiency of cars. These are things that are allowing people to go to the suburbs. These are kind of like push factors. But there are a lot of pull factors for the suburbs as well. If we look at this picture of Levittown, this is Levittown, New York. This is not the one right across the river in Pennsylvania, but they look very similar. If we look at Levittown, there's a lot of pull factors here. Cheap, affordable housing, a white picket fence, all that kind of stuff. See this building right in here. I think we're actually going to take a look at this picture in class. This building right in here. This could be a church, could be a school. These are both pull factors as well. What we also see during this time period is the growth of the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt is Southwest California, also Southeast to a lesser extent. And this is at the extent of what's sometimes referred to as the Frost Belt or the Rust Belt. So this is like the Northeast or the North. Think old industry, think Pittsburgh, think Ohio, think Detroit. This is what's known as today as the Rust Belt. And so we see people who are moving not just from cities to suburbs, which is kind of a small move, but they're also moving from north to south, broadly speaking. So speaking of immigration, both internal and international immigration increased during the time period. And the economic opportunities that we've already talked about play a big role in this. Why are people moving? They're moving for economic opportunities, both internal migration and international migration. The Immigration Law of 1965 abolishes the quota system from the 1920s. College Board likes to ask about this, and this is a good comparison question, comparing the different laws, the Quota Act of 1924, the Immigration Law of 1965, for example. Remember that quota system set quotas on the number of immigrants based on national origin. So, 2% of a country's population that's already in the United States. That's gone in 1965. And it's replaced by our current immigration system. There's been many changes that have been made, but nothing major since 1965. Families of legal immigrants living in the United States are given preferential treatment. And what we see in the Immigration Law of 1965 is that those who especially benefited from the Immigration Law of 1965, because of some exemptions that are put in there, are both Latin Americans and Asians. This is not to say that immigration from other areas of the world goes away, but we do see and have been seeing decreasing immigration from where most of our migrants came from prior to World War II, mostly Western and Eastern Europe. So we'll talk a little bit more about that immigration law in class, but it is a big one. Roman numeral 2 here, new demographic and social developments along with anxieties over the Cold War, so there's a Cold War again, changed U.S. culture and led to significant political and moral debates that sharply divided the nation. Like the College Board so often does, we tend to see key concepts. One of them is political, one is economic, and one is social. Time period 8 didn't really break down that way. Oh, sorry, I just got interrupted in mid-thought. That's going to be a fun break for you guys. So they didn't really break down political, economic, social along those lines in time period 8. But what we do see is key concept 8.3 is mostly social. And we can see that in this one. We've already talked about the Cold War. We've already talked about demographic and social developments to a lesser extent through these reform movements. We haven't talked too much about the moral debates that sharply divided the nation. What we see at the beginning of this time period is the rise of a homogeneous mass culture, homogeneous, you choose. The rise of a madmen, this is the picture I took, mass culture, this idea that everyone is striving for the same things. Everyone looks the same, everyone acts the same, everyone thinks the same. It's a very conformist culture in the 1950s. But now we're talking about mass culture here. This is not to say that there aren't people who push back against this who are non-conformists. There, of course, are. But when we look at mass culture, it's very, very conformity-driven during the 1950s and early 1960s. So why? Economic and social changes kind of allow for this. The American dream is more accessible to more people than ever before, is kind of a part of that. Also, anxiety over the Cold War causes people to recede towards traditional what they perceive as traditional values and traditional culture. You don't want to be labeled a communist. You don't want to be labeled an outsider. You want to be an insider. And so how do you mark yourself as an insider? By doing and acting like everyone else around you. Even this picture, this isn't a great picture to prove the point, but even this picture, we see more variety than a lot of times in the 1950s. This guy wearing a bow tie. Most people are not wearing bow ties. Most people are wearing black suits, all the different colored suits. So, but you get the idea. This is challenged by artists, intellectuals, and the youth. The beat movement here is the one I want to highlight. The beat movement is writers, poets, mostly who are challenging the middle class. Not poets mostly, but writers mostly, with poets in there as well. Also being challenged by intellectuals. Good evidence here is The Affluent Society, which is a book published in 1958, which is bringing attention to the fact that, okay, so this is what our mass culture is telling us America is like, but there is a darker side to America. There's a great income disparity, great meaning large, income disparity in the post-World War United States. So this title, The Affluent Society, is sort of mocking. It's sort of sarcastic in tone. Sure, America looks affluent and more people than ever have access to the American dream, but that's not to say that we don't have income disparity, and perhaps that income disparity is growing. And rock and roll. Rock and roll is very much a challenge to mass culture and the way things were. Elvis Presley, 1950s, is going to be not the first, but he's going to be one of the first to break through with this new style of music that has its roots in black culture, that has its roots in African American culture. People like Chuck Berry in the 1950s are now singing alongside Elvis Presley. Now you have radio stations that are playing what was black music. And that's a big deal. That's a very, very big deal. We can't forget how earth-shattering rock and roll music was for these types of people in the 1950s, for the old guard, for the very traditional white America. People like Elvis Presley represent a threat to the way things were. And of course, that threat is going to be carried through into the 1960s by even more radical acts. So speaking of which, feminists and the counterculture. We talked a little bit about feminists in class already. We haven't talked too much about the counterculture of the 1960s. The counterculture is mostly young, mostly white, mostly affluent people. We're talking about like teenagers, early 20s, who are rejecting their parents' generation's values. This is the generation that fought World War II. The counterculture is rejecting those values of conformity, of traditionalism, of morality, of traditional morality, at least. So ways that they challenged, drug culture, new music, Woodstock is the best example here. Economic, they rejected materialism. They sought to live a simpler life. Hardcore hippies are attempting to completely drop out of capitalist Western society. They're trying to form communes. They're trying to live off the land. There are very few people like this. But this is the ultimate manifestation of the hippie movement. In terms of political, we've already seen how the counterculture protests the Vietnam War. They're very active in civil rights movements. Notice lowercase c, lowercase r. We're not just talking about African American civil rights, but the broader civil rights movements that are happening, promoting women's rights as well. Haight-Ashbury, which is a neighborhood in San Francisco, California, becomes the epicenter of the hippie movement, especially for 1968, 1969, and 1970. And if you still visit Haight-Ashbury today, you can see remnants of the counterculture movement. Kind of sad remnants, really, because a lot of these people just got addicted to drugs and had nowhere to go by the time the movement petered out in the early 1970s. So why do we remember them today? What is the significance of the counterculture? They changed sexual norms. Think about, traditional sexual norms in this country pre-World War II. Young men and women even going out on unchaperoned dates was a big deal. Married men and women slept in separate beds. We had a very, very strict idea of what traditional sexual norms were in this country, the counterculture is really destroying a lot of that. We see rises in people who are living together before they get married, for example, people who are being more promiscuous, people who have more sexual partners before they get married. This is the America that we live in today in the 21st century, but a lot of these norms were challenged and changed by the counterculture at the time. Also, not surprisingly, greater informality in U.S. culture. If we look at the last slide here, right, this 1950s culture is again, we still have it today, but it's really challenged by the counterculture. Just look at how I dress at work, for example. Look at how teachers dress in this school. Contrast that to what it would have looked like in the 1950s, and you see the effects of the counterculture and greater informality in U.S. culture. It's important to note, and I alluded to it earlier, this movement falls apart rapidly after 1970. It's a flash in the pan. It's unsustainable. When you look at these things on a large scale are pretty unsustainable. Hippies find out quickly that they need jobs. You want to buy drugs? You need money. Where do you get money? You get money from a job. Okay, well, hippies don't want jobs because they're rejecting materialism and they're seeking a simpler life. So there's these elements of the counterculture which prove to be at odds with each other and leads to the destruction of the movement. Not unrelated to the counterculture, we see the rise of evangelical Christianity in the country, and a very large increase in people who are self-defining themselves as born-again Christians, which is related to this idea of personal conversion. There are a lot of people who are looking at the 1960s and they're seeing sin. They're seeing an America that is turning its back on traditional morality. And so the answer to that is personal salvation for a lot of people. How do we fix America? Well, the answer is Christianity for a lot of Americans in the 1970s. But this movement has its roots. We could stretch all the way back in American culture. This is a continuity in American culture where we see time periods of rebirth for Christianity. The Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, the 1830s, this type of stuff. And so we're seeing that again in the 1970s. This is accompanied by large-scale political and social activism by religious conservatives. A lot of this is in response to Roe v. Wade in 1973, which legalizes abortion. But it goes back before then. And we shouldn't see Roe v. Wade as the starting point to this. Roe v. Wade definitely adds an impetus here, but it's already going in terms of a religious conservative movement in America. Jerry Falwell and the moral majority you want to associate with the 1970s, this idea that, this is like the silent majority, right? This idea that, okay, we have this really loud, immoral sector of American culture, the hippies, the counterculture, whatever you want to call them, but that there is a moral majority that exists in this country. They're just not as vocal, and their time is now, according to Jerry Falwell and other preachers and pastors who are a part of this moral majority movement. Not surprisingly, they're galvanized by a lot of the social change that advocates are pushing for throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s. We can see this as a counter movement or a counter revolution. They oppose the Equal Rights Amendment, so Phyllis Schlafly would fit in here. Equal Rights Amendment, they say, is tearing down traditional norms of sex and gender. They oppose the Roe v. Wade decision on abortion, and they oppose abortion overall. This is where we start to get pro-life versus pro-choice. They oppose homosexuality, which they argue is a sin, and they see the Stonewall riots in 1969, and they respond to that. The roots of the moral majority are very much housed in the 1960s and what's happening with the counterculture and other various reform movements that we've taken a look at. Focus on the family is another group that we can look at during this time period if we want to see the rise of evangelical Christianity and how it's influencing conservative politics, promoting abstinence. They're against same-sex marriage, pro-life. This is still the platform of the Republican Party today. We've talked about this in class already, but the 1970s are such an important time period to understanding our country currently in terms of politics, because the Republican Party melds with this evangelical Christianity, this kind of counter-revolution, and it still has these platforms today. All right, test tips, the big ones here: rise of the conservative movement, family structure and counterculture. Essays, I already talked about immigration and how that could be a topic, and I've seen it as a topic before, and definitely the rise of the conservative movement. Making connections to the 1960s under LBJ, factors for the rise of the conservative movement. Again, I've seen an essay question related to that. Okay, so I hope it's helpful. We'll talk more about this stuff in class. Like I said, it's a little short in terms of the unit itself, and there's some overlap here to what we've already talked about, but very, very significant nonetheless. All right, see you in class.